This video contains spoilers for World Trigger, and it's pretty likely that you either haven't seen it at all, or that if you did, you dropped it early on, so if you're in either of these camps and feel like giving the show a chance and don't want stuff spoiled for you, then you probably shouldn't watch this video until you do. Yeah, I guess every retrospective video is going to have some variation of this stupid disclaimer at the beginning, because if I don't put it in here, someone will get mad and tell me I've ruined their day, so... that's that, I guess. I'm gonna start the video now. Yay! When it comes to our favourites, we all have that one anime series that we love that for some reason or another just doesn't seem to get talked about all that much. Or if it does get talked about, it's rarely discussed positively, getting shit on hard by just about anyone. At least it seems that's the case when I look at the people I'm good friends with in the anime community. And for me, that show was World Trigger, an adaptation of what's probably best described as a B-list shonen jump manga that's just kind of faded into obscurity. World Trigger is a show that means a hell of a lot to me, and it's one that I barely ever seen get brought up at all in the community, never mind being discussed at length. In fact, the only real discussion I ever remember seeing about the series, outside of the limited weekly chat in the subreddit for the latest manga chapter, was when the anime started airing in 2014 and everyone shat on it harder than Mars Basement shat on Sword Art Online Anime of the Summer for the better part of a decade. People were dropping the series in droves and were quick to criticise the show for having a generic story, cliche characters and bad animation. And this only convinced me to check out the series because I thought it would be so bad that I get a kick out of watching it. But after watching the first episode, I didn't really see any of these things that people were complaining about. Sure, the premise wasn't the most unique thing I'd ever seen, but the show executed it in a way that was interesting enough to separate it from similar anime that came before it. As for the characters, they were far from cliché, with both primary protagonists being very unique and juxtaposing one another perfectly. They made for a great main duo that looked like they had an interesting journey ahead of them. And while the aesthetics weren't perfect, they were far from awful, with striking character designs and an animation style that was honestly pretty charming, even if it wasn't the best. It was no unlimited budget works, but it was far from unwatchable. So with that experience that was seemingly the complete opposite from everyone else in the community, I kept going. I stuck with World Trigger through its entire 73 episode run, and it ended up becoming one of my favourite shows, ever. And after multiple rewatches over the last half a decade, that remains the case. It's one of the best fucking things I've ever seen. And given it an unexpected second season just finished airing, that a third season is already in the work, I figured there'd be no better time for me to talk about this show and try to get people watching it. Because truth be told, I wish people would talk about it more. It deserves to be discussed. It deserves to be watched. It deserves to be understood. And more than anything, it deserves to be remembered. I don't like to use the word underrated when I talk about a series, but if there's a show that I feel fits that description perfectly, it's World Trigger. It's criminally underrated, and it's largely gone unnoticed despite being an adaptation of a series that ran successfully in Shonen Jump for 5 years before getting moved to Jump Square due to the author's illness. Yeah, weird, isn't it? So, I figured it was time to take things into my own hands and give the series the love letter it deserves. If no one else will do it, then I guess it's up to me, so here goes, I guess. So, sit back, get comfy, and get ready to listen to this absolute fucking loser ramble on and on about a series that no one cares about for a stupid amount of time. This is a retrospective of World Trigger, and it's going to be a long one, so, yeah, have fun. So what exactly is this show? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's an adaptation of a manga that ran on Weekly Shonen Jump from 2013 until 2018, and despite the manga's B-list status, I'd argue it's probably the most inventive and well-written series in the magazine's history, next to the likes of Hunter x Hunter and Katekyo Hitman Reborn. And I know no one really gives a shit about Reborn anymore, and that my take that it's as good as Hunter x Hunter is one that no one will agree with, but that's a video for another day. Yeah. Despite being a Jump adaptation though, World Trigger's never quite received the attention you'd expect, and as I said before, it seems that what little discussion there has been of the show has been overwhelmingly negative, for reasons that I honestly think are just fucking stupid. The series takes place in Mikado City. It focuses on creatures called neighbours that start appearing from another dimension and causing chaos around the city. Standard weaponry is ineffective against the neighbours, and the human race appears to be out of their league, until a mysterious organisation named Border shows up and begins repelling the neighbours, appropriating the neighbour technology known as triggers, special weapons and tools that allow the user to channel internal energy known as Treon. Border are capable of fighting back against the neighbours and keeping the people of Mikado City safe. The story follows Yuma Kuga, a new transfer student student at the local school of Mikado City as he befriends Osamu Mikamo, a low-ranking border trainee with aspirations of becoming a high-ranking agent someday. After a neighbour attack occurs nearby, Yuma steps into action and takes down the neighbour with ease and reveals himself to be a powerful humanoid neighbour from the other side of the gate. And with this revelation, the battle between border and the neighbours takes a new turn, with Yuma at the centre of it all. On the surface, it's a pretty standard shonen fare. We've got an evil invading force from another world, we've got an organisation of superpowered high school students who use their special weapons and abilities to take down the bad guys, and we've even got a mysterious transfer student who's actually one of the evil bad guys, but he's actually a good guy. Yeah, it's all pretty typical stuff. And this is a criticism that I remember seeing a lot when everyone started dropping World Trigger in droves after its first episode. But here's the thing. While that all sounds really typical on paper, what sets World Trigger apart from other shows with a similar premise is the way that it's executed. I know this has been said many times about other shonen shows like Hunter x Hunter, mostly by people who don't really know what they're talking about, but World Trigger isn't your typical shonen. It approaches shonen storytelling in an incredibly unique way, and it all comes down to our two main characters. On the surface, Yuma is the typical special transfer student character you'd expect from a shonen series. He's very different from everyone else, being a humanoid neighbour from the other side of the gate, and he's a huge asset in combating the threat of the neighbours due to having years of combat experience under his belt, while also being in possession of an incredibly powerful trigger that's unique to him. It's standard shonen main character stuff. However, despite this, he lacks knowledge of the world around him and has little to no experience fighting alongside others. Yuma is exceptional, as is the case with shonen protagonists, but he's far from special. He doesn't understand people, nor does he truly understand the world around him, the consequences of his actions, or who you should trust. And given that most of the action in the series focuses heavily on team-oriented combat and strategies, Yuma isn't able to get very far on his own despite being extremely talented as a fighter. However, Yuma is one of two protagonists in World Trigger. Where the series truly shines and stands out from its peers in terms of character rating is Osamu Mikamo. Osamu is the complete opposite from your typical shonen protagonist. He's not special, he's not exceptional, he's not even close to average. His Creon levels are pathetically lower than average, he can't handle a trigger to save his life, and he can barely fucking run for more than 5 minutes because his stamina is almost as bad as mine when I decide to go for a walk on my lunch break. Osamu is the complete opposite of what is required of a border agent. He's pretty much useless in combat and he can barely put out enough Creon to activate a trigger, let alone handle one in a fight. However, Osamu is determined. He wants to be a high-ranking border agent more than anyone else, so he can protect the people of Mikado City and hopefully reunite with his former mentor who disappeared after crossing to the other side of the gate. And this determination is what pushes him to always do his best, even if his best is less than average. Osamu may not be a powerful fighter, but he's incredibly intelligent and observant. He understands how triggers and Creon work better than just about anyone else at Border, and he's a very tactical thinker, always strategizing and trying to figure out the best approach to whatever situation he and his team find themselves in. These brains don't go far if he's on his own, but because World Trigger is a series that's all about team-based combat, Osamu really shines when he can use his intellect to come up with a plan that takes advantage of everyone's strengths and leads them all to victory. Osamu initially starts out with nothing, but over time he really grows into his own with an incredible unique approach to being a border agent, and he doesn't really stop being his less than average self either. He doesn't get a special power-up of any kind, he's a character that fails just as often as he succeeds, and his arc is one of the most gradual but engaging ones I've ever seen from a shonen series. Osamu is what makes World Trigger what it is in a lot of ways, and is the focal point of the series' unique approach to cool anime fights, which we'll get to a little bit later. To make things even more interesting though, the dynamic between Yuma and Osamu is pretty fantastic. They're complete polar opposites in just about every way. Yuma is strong and confident, but is a bit of an airhead and lacks the social awareness to properly read other people and their intention. Meanwhile, Osamu lacks strength and doesn't really believe in himself, but his brains make him incredibly observant. Yuma is the brawn and Osamu is the brains, and the two of them make up for one another's weaknesses, making for one of the most dynamic and interesting duos I've ever seen in Jump. And this is just one of many things that World Trigger has going for it that makes it stand out from the crowd. But before I get into what else the series does well, I want to discuss our other two main characters, as well as the rest of the cast and how the show handles them. Our third main character is Chika Amatori, and she's basically a little girl with a fuck ton of Creon. Like, she literally has godlike levels of the stuff to the point that her using a sniper rifle basically makes it a long-range cannon that could level an entire city. This, however, makes her a prime target for invading neighbours who want to utilise her Creon for their own needs. What makes Chika interesting though, beyond her being an adorable little chick that can level entire cities, is her character arc. She struggles a lot with internal conflict and self-hatred, due to the people around her disappearing as a result of the neighbours' interest in her high Creon output. She develops a complex where she's unwilling to ask people for help out of a fear that they'll be next, and this also causes a mental block where she's unable to actively harm anyone directly, whether they be a human or a neighbour, which is a massive Achilles heel in her otherwise overpowered abilities. It's a really interesting and well explored character arc with a realistic portrayal of trauma and how it can affect how a person acts, while also being a logical way for the series to not just have Chika blow everything up with a single shot every time an enemy shows up. And yeah, she's really cute. Did I mention that already? And finally we have Jin Yuichi, who serves as both a mentor for the main trio and is one of Border's greatest assets when pushing back the invading neighbours. Jin is a high-ranking Border agent who was more or less the catalyst to Samu joining Border, having saved his life prior to the start of the series, and he's also the driving force behind a lot of the events that take place throughout the story. Unlike the rest of the main characters, Jin doesn't really have much of a development arc, but he more than makes up for it with his shining personality and god-tier badassery. Every time Jin is on screen, he's an absolute joy to watch, delivering the perfect blend of light-hearted comedy and complete fucking awesomeness. As for what makes Jin so awesome, well, simply put, he has the ability to see the future and is able to assist Border in preparing for the otherwise unforeseen neighbour invasions. That, and he can also use his ability to his own advantage during fights, which when combined with his special trigger Fujin makes him almost unstoppable in combat. Like, seriously. In the second arc of the series there's this entire segment where Jin ends up on Border's bad side due to disobeying orders to pursue his own interests, and he's just fucking fights everyone, including top-ranking offensive agents. He wins! But in spite of his overpowered status, Jin isn't overutilised in the story, nor is he ever really used to magically solve any and every problem that Border and our heroes are met with. He's instrumental to the success, but he isn't a walking Gary Stu, and he actually spends a lot of his time either goofing around or pursuing his own interest, which makes it all the more cathartic when he does show up and decides to help everyone out. It makes these handful of moments feel like a real treat when they happen, and it's a nice change from what a lot of similar shows of a similar character would normally do. And like I said, Jin is also one of the show's more morally complex characters, given that he's always seemingly operating within his own interests rather than those of Border. They more often than not line up, but Jin's goal seems to be less focused on eliminating the neighbours and more towards living in harmony with, and he takes a very clear interest in Yuma as a result of that goal, seeing him as the perfect step towards achieving that, which is what leads to the aforementioned conflict in the second arc that I mentioned before. But that's just our main characters. What about the supporting cast? Well, World Trigger handles them brilliantly. One of the most common criticisms I see about Battle Shonen series is that they have tons and tons of secondary characters, but that they rarely, if ever, get fully fleshed out and don't really contribute all that much to the story, outside of the occasional cool fight scene. I don't have a source for this, and I can't bother finding one because I've already spent like a month writing this script, so you'll just need to take my word for it, alright? But World Trigger spends a lot of time fleshing out its secondary cast, to the point that pretty much all of them feel like fully realised characters with unique character designs, well-defined personalities, unique powers and abilities, and clear motivations and goals, despite the fact that there are literally almost 100 of them. Almost every Border agent that we're introduced to in the series is memorable and gets some kind of development in some way, and they all get their chance to shine and contribute something meaningful to the story. There are so many squads within Border, and yet every single squad actually gets their moment, and the chemistry and bond between each of their individual members actually gets thoroughly explored, and we're given a good understanding of why they're together and why they all joined the fight against the neighbour. It's a nice change from something like Bleach, where we're introduced to all these different squads and captains, only for half of them to get like one or two cool fights and show off big magic sword and then do nothing else for the entire series. And before I get accused of throwing another show under the bus, fuck. Of course, it's still not perfect, and there are a handful of characters that just slip through the cracks, but for the most part, almost every Border agent feels like a fully realised character with a backstory, a unique personality, and a clear arc ahead of them. In fact, the characters are so well explored that I've actually seen people complain that the series spends too much time developing its secondary characters instead of just showing us cool fights, which is honestly just wild to me. It's not uncommon for World Trigger to introduce us to a new squad and for the focus to suddenly shift to said squad's backstory and who they are as individuals. I've seen people write this stuff off as filler, but I personally think it's one of the show's biggest strengths and what separates it from a lot of other shonen. It can definitely grind things to a bit of a halt sometimes, but I really appreciate that Daisuke Ashihara actually treats every character as important to the larger story. It makes Border feel like a fully realised organisation as opposed to some nebulously defined entity that the main characters just happen to be a part of. Outside of its character though, where World Trigger also shines is in how it approaches the typical shonen fight. Trion is an incredibly unique power system, and it handles things similarly to that of Nen from Hunter x Hunter, where tactics and making the best use of one's limited abilities is far more valuable than brute force or power level. Now, I know it's a bit of a meme to say that most shonen series don't use tactics in their fights to some degree, and then it's even more than of a meme to say that Hunter x Hunter is unique in that regard, but really, trust me when I say, World Trigger takes it to a whole other level, to the point that I can confidently say I've never seen anything quite like it. So, I better explain this shit. In combat, characters use special weapons called triggers, which are classified by different types. These types range from swords, guns, shields, support items such as cloaking devices, special platforms that the user can boost off of to allow for extra mobility, etc. There's so many different types, each with their own unique strengths and weaknesses, and every trigger user is limited to how many they can equip at a given time, meaning they need to choose wisely when deciding which ones to use. On top of that, skill and ingenuity is a big part of making the most out of a trigger's abilities. Though Kogetsu, for example, is the most popular sword type trigger among border agents because of how durable and well-rounded it is in close combat. But some users prefer to use the Scorpion because its shape and size can be adjusted to different situations, and it can also be drawn from any part of the body, at the cost of being far less durable and easily breakable in close quarter fights. Some sniping agents may prefer to use the Eaglet Sniper Rifle trigger due to its range and accuracy, but a user with an incredibly high Treon level might opt to use the Ibis Sniper trigger instead, even though it has lower accuracy due to its increased firepower, which when combined with a high Treon level could make for devastating results. On top of the basic triggers, there are also optional enhancements that can be added, such as lead bullets, which don't inflict damage and consume a high amount of Treon, but they can pass through shields and weigh down any part of the body they come into contact with. Or there's a Thruster, which allows the user to propel their weapon or themselves in any chosen direction at the cost of consuming large amounts of Treon. The combinations of main triggers, secondary triggers, and optional triggers are incredibly vast, and the unique application of each of these is seemingly endless, to the point that every single battle in the series is unpredictable in where it could go. Almost every character has their own unique way of utilising their chosen triggers, which makes every fight engaging and super memorable. And that's just the standard triggers. We haven't even touched on unique triggers, which are a whole other kettle of fish. There are plenty of characters in the series who have also made their own unique modifications to existing triggers, such as Yosuke, who's modified his Kogetsu from a sword to a spear, which has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. Or Kyosuke, whose special trigger Geist allows him to increase his speed and power to ridiculously high levels, at the cost of his Treon body being destroyed in a matter of seconds after activating it and no longer being able to battle. And last but not least, we have the black triggers, which are incredibly powerful, unique triggers that are created from another Treon user giving up their life and pouring it into a trigger. They're basically just really powerful triggers that require someone else's life in order to be created, which makes them incredibly rare. To add to that rarity, they can also only be used by someone who's compatible with the personality of the person who died to create it. However, they are unmatched in both their power and unique abilities, with Yuma's black trigger being a prime example, resembling a combat suit that can use special seals that allow him to perform all kinds of incredible feats, such as being able to send himself or others flying, or being able to enhance the power of his own attacks. So yeah, there's a lot of depth to this crazy system. And despite how long the series has gone on for, it honestly feels like it's barely scratched the surface. New types of triggers and new ways of using them are introduced in the series on a regular basis, especially when the neighbours show up and they possess their own unique triggers that are different from those used by the border agents. The fights themselves are also unpredictable in another more straightforward way, in the sense that victory is never always assured for our heroes. Our three protagonists find themselves struggling quite a bit, whether it be due to a large gap in experience or simply tactics gone wrong, and there are many occasions where they flat out find themselves defeated and need to learn from their mistakes and come back stronger, or with a new strategy to give them an advantage. Even the situations where they do come out on top are rarely one-sided and prove to be a huge struggle, with the opposition pushing back in every conceivable way, which personally had me on the edge of my seat the entire time. There's so many times where something fucking unexpected would happen and I would just scream like an absolute man-child because of how fucking mental it was. I know I'm probably not doing this any justice. I know I'm not very good at explaining things, which has probably been clear to anyone who's watched my stuff before, but it's just incredible. When it comes to shonen fights, World Trigger is probably among the best I've ever seen, and if you're a fan of the brains over brawn approach to cool anime fights, I can't recommend the series enough. But not every series is without its flaws, and despite this show being one of my all-time favourites, even I can admit that it does suffer in some areas. Most notably the production. I said at the beginning of this video that one of the most common complaints about World Trigger was its animation and how not good it was. And while I definitely think that the criticism towards the animation was ridiculously overblown, and that dropping a show solely because of how it looks is incredibly misguided, I'm not going to pretend that it's immune from criticism, because it isn't. World Trigger isn't a bad looking show, nor is it even necessarily a badly directed one, but much like the reception of the show in general, this adaptation deserved better. I will always defend the character designs, and I generally do not understand why people think they aren't good, because they're all incredibly striking and memorable, with every character standing out amongst the crowd, but the animation isn't the best a lot of the time. Like I said, I really think that a lot of the negative criticism is thrown at the show's visuals, particularly its early episodes, were over-exaggerated and overly harsh, but there's a lot of moments where it feels like stuff should be impactful and instead it just kind of isn't. The early episodes especially are pretty bad for this, where a lot of the fights feel floaty and not impactful. But as the show goes on, this definitely becomes less of an issue, at least I thought so. During the second arc of the series there's a notable improvement, and by the time the anime reaches the large-scale invasion arc, the show looks pretty competent, sometimes even great. I'm not gonna lie, it never quite reaches the levels of something like My Hero Academia in its first season, but it does the job, and I'd argue it does it well for the most part in the later episodes. That doesn't excuse the earlier episodes, nor does it change the fact that the animation could generally just be better, but Did it really deserve the ridicule it got back when it first started airing? I don't think so. World Trigger is far from the worst looking anime of 2014, let alone of all time. Honestly, in terms of the show's production, I don't even think the biggest issue is with the art or animation, but rather the way the show is directed and paced. I don't know what the hell it is when it comes to toy animation and drawing scenes out to the point it sometimes feels awkwardly slow, but there were a good number of scenes where characters will be talking or stuff happens and then the scene will just kinda stop. And there'll be this really awkward silence. Almost as if they're deliberately trying to draw specific scenes out. This is particularly noticeable towards the end of the first season of the anime, where they were catching up to the manga and started adapting a chapter per episode on top of re-showing scenes from the previous episode to fill in time. It's really annoying, but despite my complaining, I don't really think it's too big of a problem in all honesty. Repeated scenes can be skipped easily enough, and the drawn out scenes, while annoying and a little awkward, don't really affect anything in the grand scheme of things. Oh yeah, and there's this fucking weird thing that the show does where they just start putting the opening in the middle of the episode for some reason, and I generally don't understand what the fuck that was ever all about. If someone could explain to me why a show would ever do this, please let me know. It's been bothering me for half a decade, keeps me up at night. And honestly, well, the first season of the anime is the bulk of the adaptation for now, being 73 episodes. The second season, which just recently wrapped up, completely fixes every single one of these issues, and it seems that this is going to remain the case going forward in season 3. Honestly, the animation has never been better and reaches the quality of the best looking shonen on many occasions. Like, there was a point in the second season where the animation quality was just jaw-dropping and I actually screamed at my screen because I couldn't fucking believe my eyes. I had to go back and rewatch the scene because I thought I was making shit up in my head. Seriously, the show has never looked better than it does now. The pacing is also completely fixed, with multiple chapters being adapted each episode and the long pauses removed completely. And the opening even plays at the beginning of the episodes now. Truly revolutionary stuff for anime. But in all seriousness, I can understand why people took issue with the show's presentation. As someone who considers World Trigger one of their favourite animes, even I'm willing to admit that the show falls short when it comes to its visuals. But I also think that dropping a show solely because of how it looks and completely ignoring everything else it does right is incredibly short-sighted. Anime is a visual medium and the visuals play a big role in making a show work, but they also aren't the be-all end-all when it comes to something being good. Good visuals can elevate a show, but so can good writing, and World Trigger has amazing writing that more than makes up for its lacking visual. Plus, the later episodes, and especially season 2, fix those problems anyway, so yeah. And that's pretty much everything I have to say about World Trigger. I could honestly talk about the series all day and dive deep into the show, arc by arc, scene by scene, and find stuff to talk about, but I don't want to spoil too much for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's a series where you're best left surprised during its key moments. In spite of all that though, I hope that this video was able to convince someone to give the series a look and... You thought I forgot about the music, didn't you? If you drop World Trigger early on because of its initially standard premise and its lacklustre visuals, I understand, but I also implore you, as someone who loves the show to death and who considers it a favourite, to give it another chance. It takes a while to pick up, but once it does, it's honestly an experience like no other. There's really no other anime quite like this one, and I'm glad that it was considered successful enough to some degree that it got renewed for a second and third season, even if we had to wait half a decade. I am but one voice in a massive community, and my reach is minuscule. I'm a small channel, I make videos as a hobby in my spare time, and I don't really expect to be able to make a difference. But like I said in the beginning of this video, World Trigger means the world to me, and it deserves to be watched. It deserves to be understood. And more than anything, it deserves to be remembered. So if there's anything anyone takes away from this stupidly long, rambly video, it's this. Give World Trigger a chance. Maybe you'll wind up loving it, like I did. Or maybe not. I just want people to give the series a proper shot, because I've never really met anyone who's seen it, let alone enjoyed it. And if you're a fan of the series like myself, feel free to share this video around. Let's spread the word and let everyone know that World Trigger is awesome and it deserves to be remembered. And if you're interested in the series, or even if you didn't like the series, feel free to leave a comment or whatever. Let's get a discussion going. I'm always down to talk about stuff I love with others. Or you can just leave a comment telling me that my videos are just low-res JPEGs on screen while I deep throat my mic. That's always fun. I have been Leth, and I'll see you in the next. Oh yeah, and before I go, the dub for this series is so fucking bad, because it's by Ocean. Yeah, that Ocean. They're still around, apparently. Somehow. I'll let this shit speak for itself.
Maybe visiting Tamakoma Branch is something I shouldn't do too often after all. Incidentally, Miss Konami, when you walked into the hospital, did you step in with your right foot like you're supposed to?
Why? What for?
Haven't you heard the legend before? When you walk in the Mikado City General, you have to step in with your right foot.
Bye.
無休の時を泳いだ命の波を感じてた禁止